Howdy y'all, and welcome back to Country Fried Minis. I'm your host Cameron, the country boy in the big city, presenting to you once again from my temporary studio location on account of these ongoing repairs to my apartment. And today I'd like to come before you to finish up these summertime mechs and get them painted to a nice standard. Returning viewers of the Country Fried Minis channel might notice my microphone here. I used it 2 episodes ago, but I forgot it in the last one, and at the request of one of my subscribers, I'm going to go ahead and try and use it and have some better audio. I think it should improve these talking head segments going forward. Now, for those of you who were here for part 1, you'll know that I left the last episode on a bit of a cliffhanger on account of some serious overspray while putting the base coats on with an airbrush. Today I'm going to talk about those and how I fixed them up and paint these models up to a glorious standard to put them on the tabletop. There we go. Easy does it. Little at a time. No overspray. Well, that's not too bad. Not the worst, I suppose. Yeah, Picking up where we left off last time, I was spraying on some Mephiston Red on the sausage portion of this here Glizzy Goblin, and I lost my brush control right at the very end. This was really disastrous for my base coat in progress, but I decided to not let it bother me too much and go ahead and fix it up with the brush painting in the next step. Here you can see I'm using some thinned down Baylor Brown to go ahead and brush back on the bun color over top of these overspray portions. Unfortunately, since we're going to cover over Mephiston Red, this color's going on a bit more opaque than usual and is not going to have those nice smooth blends that the airbrush can create. Still, we're going to take our time and brush it over all these overspray portions and cover over those mistakes. The later steps are going to go a long way in tamping down that color discrepancy between this brush painted color and the airbrushed color. Furthermore, knowing that the later steps are going to blend in this layer, we can go ahead and be a little more rough with the application, so long as we don't get the color on any areas that are obviously supposed to be another color or in the crevices between panels. I say that with a caveat here, as these dimples on the front of the Krabby Gatty are also going to be the same Baylor Brown. Now, having finished up the application of that first layer of Baylor Brown, I'm going to bust out my trusty Liquitex titanium white acrylic ink and mix a little bit into the color to start adding some rough highlights. Now this stuff can strongly pigment your highlight color, so it's good to be real careful in the amount you choose to add to your paint. In this case, I'm only going to put a single drop into my little puddle of Baylor Brown before slapping that edge highlight on. Furthermore, since I want to impart a little bit of translucency to this highlight, I'm going to go ahead and add some of this contrast medium from the Citadel Color Technical line. Just one drop. Now, with that mixed up, we're going to go back to the model and start applying some real rough edge highlights to the model. Again, we're going to really tamp down these layers later and blend them together real nice so we can be really rough with the application here. For that, I'm going to apply some rough edge highlights to all the panel lining on this model, as well as put some sketchy highlights on the raised portions to suggest the voluminous nature of the shapes. It's both a relief to paint these highlights so rough, as well as a necessity, as the later steps are really going to tamp down that work. So for that, all these highlight areas need to be fairly exaggerated so that they continue to show up after the washing step later. As is my usual habit with these models, I'm going to go ahead and add yet another drop to that mixed up highlight color so that we can add a second layer of highlights and really accentuate the colors that we put down. I find this a little unusual, as we're both going to follow this new idea of the rough highlights as well as the traditional approach to edge highlighting, wherein we'll leave a little bit of the previous color showing and apply less paint to help suggest a three-dimensional nature of this model. Again, it was real liberating to apply these highlight layers in such a rough fashion. My concerns for cleanliness as well as accuracy and application were about halved, and that took so much stress away and made this process almost blissful. Furthermore, I really love the painterly feel that these sketchy highlight layers are going to impart into the model. Next, we're going to clean up the blends where the limbs meet the body using some Warboss Green by Citadel. I really want to preserve some of the blends here, so I need this step to be super transparent. So for that, I'm going to add a whole bunch of this contrast medium to the Warboss Green to form a nice, thin, almost wash-like consistency. Although I don't have accurate measurements here, I'd estimate that I've applied this medium at about a 2:1 ratio, medium to paint. Now, I'm going to take this mix and apply it just to where the joints meet the body. I want to get rid of all that overspray from the red and the brown over the green and kind of blend them a little better. Again, this mixture isn't perfect because we're not getting those nice smooth blends from the airbrush, but it's going to blend in the mistakes that we made earlier in trying this new way of painting model. Fixing it up is easy as pie. With that step finished, we're just going to keep going down the color list and clean up the areas that have been hit with the airbrush. Next up on that color list is this here phalanx yellow, which we're going to use to clean up the left arm of the Glizzy Goblin and the coolant pods on the Krabby Gatty. Nothing special compared to the other layers here, just applying a thin down color to clean up any overspray or discrepancies in the color on the portions that are intended to be phalanx yellow. Also worth note here, we're applying this color on fairly opaque as we're not really looking for a blend, but rather a nice bold color separation between the yellow and the other colors on the model. Of course, just like every other color on this model, we're going to add a couple drops of the Liquitex white ink to this here yellow to create a lighter shade for the layered highlighting. Again, just as with the sketchy highlights on the Baylor Brown, we're going to apply this lightened tone in a fashion that suggests the volume of the model rather than clean edge highlighting. Since this portion is basically just a cylinder, that highlight is going to consist of a band of light running the length of the volume. I'll also follow that up with a tiny bit of edge highlighting, but the main focus here is going to be that band of color running along the top of this portion. I believe in this case I also accentuated the voluminous highlight with an extra focus during the next highlight layer. In my mind, it's more important for the viewer to recognize some realism in the shading on the cylinder rather than the forced highlights on the edges. Following up the work on the Glizzy Goblin, we're going to apply the same concept to these here coolant pods on the Krabby Gatty. Since these shapes are also cylindrical volumes, we're going to go ahead and apply this highlight in the form of a band along the uppermost facing portion of this shape. Also worth note, since these coolant pods are on the back and not part of the focal front of the model, we're not going to spend a ton of effort edge highlighting them, instead choosing to stick to the simple voluminous shading that we've applied. Continuing onwards, with that out of the way, we're going to switch to this Citadel Moot Green and apply some edge highlighting to the limbs on the model. Unlike the rest of the model so far, I'm choosing to use solely edge highlighting here and let the airbrush blending do all the work suggesting the volumes on the limbs. Since I want the focal point of the model to be the torso and face, I'm not as concerned about adding a bunch of detail to the limbs. Furthermore, the weathering layers we're going to apply later are going to obscure a lot of the effort we put in here, so it's good to only really invest that hard effort into the focal points on the model. And with that in mind, these rough edge highlights are going to read right through that weathering, even though we're going to apply it a little heavier on the limbs of this model. Of course, although we're putting less effort into this portion of the model, it wouldn't truly be a Country Fried Minis creation if it didn't receive 2 layers of highlights. Naturally, this 50-50 blend of moot green and titanium white ink is going to be applied much more sparingly than the previous layer. Used correctly, even though this is just a quick 2-step highlight, this can impart a real sense of depth to the panels on these legs and arms. Naturally, this second layer of highlights is going to be applied much more liberally to portions of the model that would face direct sunlight. Most notably here would be the upper edges of the claws on this here crab. Furthermore, I contend that this real rough nature on these highlights will help reduce those obvious layer lines on certain portions of this 3D printed model. Unfortunately, since my 3D printer is first generation, it still doesn't have quite the resolution that the modern counterparts have. On down the checklist of colors, and we're going to apply some Mephiston Red back to this model. Much as with the rest of the model, this first layer of the color is to clean up any portions of the model that have overspray or underspray and return them to the proper opacity so that it'll read clearly as the color we want it to be. The worst offender here being the top of this Glizzy Goblin's head. Of course, just as was the case while spraying this color on the first time, it's going to require some brush control to not get it on the lighter tones underneath it. Mephiston Red has a really strong pigment quality and can easily stain other colors if we go outside the lines. But, that being said, we're going to do some really heavy weathering later, so this step doesn't necessarily require your best precision, but maybe your second best. Now with some rinsing and repeating, as is the Country Fried Minnie's way, we're going to apply 2 layers of highlight in a real sketchy fashion to this model to really force a sense of scale to this small model. Once again, since I'm painting on a cylindrical form, I'm going to concentrate the highlights in a band of color running along the length of the cylinder on the portion that would receive the most light. Once again in that real rough, painterly, almost expressionistic fashion. Nice. Looking good there, hot dog man. Now, with the final of the non-metallic colors, we're going to go ahead and apply some of this Mournfang Brown by Citadel. Since this color is of the Citadel baseline, it's going to be a little thicker than the layer type paints and require a bit more thinning than the others. I believe in this case just an extra drop of water will do, since we're not using a whole bunch of it and only putting it on the Krabby Gatty to suggest a patty inside. And much as was the case with the Mephiston Red, we need to be real careful not to get this highly pigmented paint on any of the lighter colors. But with some steady breathing and some steady hands, this shouldn't be any trouble for any painter of any skill level. And with that comes time to apply the metallics. I'm a huge fan of this here gunmetal color by the Army Painter War Paints, and I highly recommend it if you haven't picked one up for your collection. Army Painter colors are fairly inexpensive and come in this convenient dropper bottle so they last a real long time, which is such a breath of fresh air when compared to Citadel's horrible paint pots which spill and dry out all the time. I can't help but feel that this is probably a capitalistic choice to get you to buy more paint pots. Although this makes sense from a corporate viewpoint, I really wish they'd get on board and produce some nice dropper bottles for the community. Oh, where was I? I guess with that waffling I missed the transition. Here we're going to apply some Nuln Oil straight out of the pot onto the metallic areas to give them a nice grimy shading. This stuff's great, despite the terrible paint pot which is really prone to spilling. Plus it combines perfect with this Army Painter gunmetal. And with those last few brush strokes, you can see that with a little bit of work, we can cover over even the most heinous of overspray problems after the base coat. Veteran painters out there might realize that I've put on these highlights in a real rough manner, and usually that doesn't look too great on models. However, that roughness is going to be tamped down in our next step, which is going to be some oil washing. Although any kind of oil paint will work for this, I suggest choosing one of high quality. For that, I've elected to use this here Winsor & Newton brand Artist Oil color in 2 different colors. My first tube here is Lamp Black, and my second one is Burnt Sienna. Together they'll mix up into a really nice ruddy brown color that I can use to wash all over these models. Anytime I'm mixing up an oil wash, I'm going to put out some of the paint onto a palette made of cardboard. The cardboard is perfect because it's made of brown paper, and brown paper is just the best thing for absorbing oil. If you ask any southerner who's experienced in frying foods, they'll tell you the same thing. And while that oil is absorbing into the cardboard, we're going to pour out some of this here white spirit into a small dish. I want you all to remember to use this stuff in a well ventilated room, or at least wear a nice respirator as you do it. I'll include a purchase link from Amazon down below in the description, and you can pick one up just like the model I use. So let's go ahead and pour some of this out. Also, maybe consider doing this a little more carefully than I have here, because I done made a gigantic mess as I pour it out. From what I understand, you can buy large containers of long pipettes from Amazon for real cheap, and I probably should have invested in that rather than spilling this all over my workstation. Digressing, now that that spill's all cleaned up and the oil has had a chance to absorb into the cardboard, we're going to start mixing some of the oil paint into this here white spirits. For this task, it's always best to start with your lighter colors if you're going to blend them together, because you can always add more dark to it, but you can't really take it away. As you can see, I've mixed this up into a real thin wash, somewhere in between the color of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. And as we mix it up close to the consistency we want, we're going to brush a little bit onto this here piece of cardboard to check the consistency for translucency. And now that we've got that all mixed up, we're going to take our models and we're going to slap this all over every square inch of them. It's going to look like it's ruined your paint job, but that's nothing to fret because we're going to clean that up right afterwards. The first time I tried doing this oil wash, I was in a pure state of panic as I thought I ruined my model. However, now that I've done this a few times, I've really learned to love this portion and really enjoy seeing this stuff slop over every square inch. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to ensure extreme coverage that completely coats this model. Now once we've applied this to the models, we're going to go ahead and set a 30-minute timer and let this oil paint partially cure. Ah yes, the sweet, sweet, comforting sounds of Bill making stuff in the background. Go check his channel out if you really like this oil washing stuff. He does it just right. Now once we've allowed this plenty of time to dry, we're going to go back to our white spirit and pour some out into a clean container. Once again, maybe consider using a pipette to put this out instead of trying to pour it straight out of the container, so you don't have to keep cleaning up after yourself. Digressing, from here we're going to go ahead and grab a tool to start cleaning off the excess oil wash. Here I chose to use cotton swabs, which can actually shred up a little bit, so I recommend something like a makeup sponge. Although if you don't have those handy, cotton swabs work perfectly fine, albeit with a little bit of shredding of the material as you work. And now we're going to use our tool dipped in some white spirit to go ahead and remove the oil paint from the raised surface of these models. This step is really awesome and allows you to flex your artistic muscles as you choose the portions which will be lighter in color and the portions which will retain that dark grimy shading. I really love the results that this step can provide because you can take it as far as you choose to, whether you want to keep this effect real subtle or go ahead and grime the heck out of your models. I've gone for somewhere in the middle on these models, and they have a real nice grimy look as would be properly befitting some greasy grilled meat sandwiches that are also mixed. How very fun.
Now see, wasn't that so much fun to do? I know that a novice painter could look at these ingredients and feel real intimidated as they're out of the norm for miniature painting, but really it's pretty close to the traditional painting methods. I think it was the best choice here because my base coats were real rough and my highlights were real rough, so this here oil paint brings them back down to a nice playable standard. You know, I think the results of this ink wash over top of this rough shading are absolutely gorgeous. They look quite gritty and battle ready and very immersive in their environment despite being so silly and food flavored. Now that we've got the ink wash all finished up, we're going to go ahead and do a little chipping with a sponge and add on some extra metal flakes with the brush. Go ahead and detail up the bases and hit them with a varnish and get them looking pretty for the tabletop.
First up on this here final detailing process, we're going to do a little bit of sponge chipping with this here Vallejo black paint. After putting a little bit on the wet palette, I'm going to go ahead and grab a piece of leftover foam from one of my battle foam sheets. This step don't require but a tiny piece of foam, so I'm going to go ahead and tear the end up and rough it up so it'll be usable for this step. Giving the foam rough edges contributes to an irregularity of pattern, which we really want in this instance. Once prepared, we're going to pick up this piece of foam with the tweezers, dunk it in the paint, and then use a paper towel to dab off almost all of the paint. I can't stress enough that we want to remove almost all of the paint entirely because we want to create very little specks of color when we apply it to the model. With very nearly all of the paint removed from this sponge, we're going to use it to attack the model from different angles and apply a chipping pattern to it that's going to look in scale. It's for that reason that we want to remove most of the paint so we don't get any oversized chips that look out of place. Although it's extremely easy to overdo this step, I personally want these two models to look really battle worn and quite ill maintained. After all, it's hard to put a top coat of paint on when your model's covered in fry oil. So to achieve that look, I'm going to go round and round these models and hit it from almost every angle to ensure that nearly every surface has a ton of chips on it. I mean it, I really want to take these models to the edge of too much. They should look really battered up by the time I'm done with this. Of course, that's just the first part when it comes to applying these chips to the models. Next I'm going to go back to the Army Painter gunmetal so that I can apply a second layer of chips using the brush. By brushing on a second layer of metallic chipping using this here gunmetal, we can go ahead and simulate damage that goes completely through the paint job and the primer down to the bare metal of these mechs. To really accentuate this variation of tones, I'm not going to apply this metallic color to all the chips. Rather, I'm going to reserve it for the larger areas of black paint and the sharp edges of panels. Really any area that would strike my eye as particularly prone to damage. Again, this variation of tone is going to provide some depth to these here chips and really accentuate the gritty feel that I've already established using the oil wash. It's a lot more understated than the black portion of the chips, but it really adds a whole layer of depth and complexity to this paint job. It's one of those subtle effects that'd be really easy to miss, but you'd miss it if it wasn't there. Next up, we're going to go ahead and do the lens jeweling on the canopies. So for that, I'm going to start with this here Cantor Blue by Citadel Colors. Since we're nearly done with these models, it's really important to maintain some really good brush control here and immediately clean up any mistakes if we go outside the lines. And once that Cantor Blue is laid down, we're going to go ahead and put a little bit of turquoise paint in the right side of each of these cockpit canopies. Now, with that final detail completed on the bodies of these mechs, we're going to return to our Vallejo black paint and paint up the base rims. I really love this step. It's almost like you can see the light at the end of the tunnel and you know that these models are almost completely done. It won't be long now and they'll be all finished up and ready to hit the tabletop. And with that, now it's time to varnish. And once that's dried up, we're going to get out a temporary palette to put out some of that good old hobby favorite on. Gloss, Mod, Podge. Now we're going to take some of this lovely stuff and kind of glob it on all the portions that are painted up blue. We want a thick coat so it'll set up real shiny once the model's dry. It may look white now, but it's definitely going to set up clear and super shiny. Man, this stuff is awesome. It's no wonder crafters love it. Onwards and downwards with another hobby product here, this time in the form of Citadel's Astro Granite Texture Paste. You could easily make your own. In fact, check out Bill Making Stuff's video on Crustard if you want to, but I find this pot of Citadel product to be pretty convenient, especially considering how infrequently I use this. Just make sure to apply it with an old crusty brush that you're not using for painting no more. And lastly, we're back around to that accursed Mephiston red. How appropriate that we're going to finish up these models with this color, especially considering all the trouble it gave me at the start of the episode. I'm just going to thin it down a bit and use it to write on the front facing edge of the hex base, Eat at Joe's. A friendly reminder that it's always good to mark the front facing edge of your hex bases when playing Battletech, as the game really demands that you know exactly where the front facing is. The front facing can be a little ambiguous, especially if the mech is modeled with a torso twist. And with that, they're done. Of course, I felt pretty obliged to try this here hot dog and hamburger themed models, as summertime cookouts were such a big part of my life growing up. Now that I live in the city, I'm a little more isolated, but I can bring that fun to my tabletop experience to really live up that summertime experience. Finally, at the end, I'm glad that y'all decided to come back and see how these models turned out. Today wasn't quite as humorous as the part one, but I wanted it a little more informative and to have something where you could potentially follow along. It was a lot of fun painting these up and real easy to do. Furthermore, I'd like to make an offer today. I want to give these models away to one of my viewers. All you need to do is comment down below and give me some idea of what you think these mechs would be armed with. It doesn't have to be a record sheet, and it doesn't even have to make too much sense. In the end, I'll pick the comment that I like the most and ship them out sometime soon. In wrapping up, I want to thank y'all once again for joining me here at Country Fried Minis. I always seem to make fun of these projects, and I hope that y'all are having fun painting too. And of course, I want you to remember, stay happy while you're painting. Thanks again, and take it easy, fellers.